The figure standing over the wizard glowered at Abby. "Your part here is finished. Go." Abby scuttled into the grass. The woman pushed the hood back and cast off her cloak. In the near darkness, Abby could see the woman's long braid and red leather uniform. It was one of the women Abby had been told about, the women used to capture those with magic, the Mordsith. The Mordsith watched with satisfaction as the wizard at her feet writhed in choking pain. "Well, well. Looks like the first wizard himself has just made a very big mistake." The belts and straps of her red leather uniform creaked as she leaned down towards him, grinning at his agony. "I have been given the whole night to make you regret ever having lifted a finger to resist us. In the morning I am to allow you to watch as our forces annihilate your people. Afterwards, I am to take you to Lord Rahl himself, the man who ordered the death of your wife, so you can beg him to order me to kill you too." She kicked him. "So you can beg Lord Rahl for your death, as you watch your daughter die before your eyes." Zed could only scream in horror and pain. On her hands and knees, Abby crabbed her way farther back into the weeds and rushes. She wiped at her eyes, trying to see. She was horrified to witness what was being done to the man who had agreed to help her for no more reason than a debt to her mother. By contrast, these people had coerced her service by holding hostage the life of her child. As she backed away, Abby saw the knife the Mordsith had dropped when Zed had thrown her into the weeds. The knife was a pretext, used to provoke him to act. It was magic that was the true weapon. The Mordsith had used his own magic against him, used it to cripple and capture him, and now used it to hurt him. It was the price demanded. Abby had complied. She had no choice. But what toll was she imposing on others? How could she save her daughter's life at the cost of so many others? Would Jana grow up to be a slave to people who would do this? With a mother who would allow it? Jana would grow up to learn to bow to Panis Rahl and his minions, to submit to evil, or worse, grow up to become a willing party to the scourge, never tasting liberty or knowing the value of honor. With dreadful finality, everything seemed to fall to ruin in Abby's mind. She snatched up the knife. Zed was wailing in pain as the Mordsith bent, doing some foul thing to him. Before she had time to lose her resolve, Abby was moving towards the woman's back. Abby had butchered animals. She told herself that this was no different. These were not people, but animals. She lifted the knife. A hand clamped over her mouth. Another seized her wrist. Abby moaned against the hand, against her failure to stop this madness when she had had the chance. A mouth close to her ear urged her to hush. Struggling against the figure in a hooded cloak that held her, Abby turned her head as much as she could, and in the last of the daylight saw violet eyes looking back. For a moment she couldn't make sense of it, couldn't make sense of how the woman could be there when Abby had seen her remain behind. But it truly was her. Abby stilled. The mother confessor released her and, with a quick hand signal, urged her back. Abby didn't question, she scurried back into the rushes as the mother confessor reached out towards the woman in red leather. The Mordsith was bent over, intent on her grisly business with the screaming wizard. In the distance, bugs chirped and clicked. Frogs called with insistent croaks. Not far away the river sloshed and burbled as it always did, a familiar, comforting sound of home. And then there came a sudden, violent concussion to the air. thunder without sound. It drove the wind from Abby's lungs. The wallop nearly knocked her senseless, making every joint in her body burn in sharp pain. There was no flash of light, just that pure and flawless jolt to the air. The world seemed to stop in its terrible splendor. Grass flattened as if in a wind radiating out in a ring from the Mordsith and the Mother Confessor. Abby's senses returned as the pain in her joints thankfully melted away. Abby had never seen it done before, and had never expected to see it in the whole of her life, but she knew without doubt that she had just witnessed a confessor unleashing her power. From what Abby's mother had told her, it was the destruction of a person's mind so complete that it left only numb devotion to the confessor. She had but to ask and they would confess any truth, no matter the crime they had previously attempted to conceal or deny. "Mistress," the Mordsith moaned in piteous lamentation. Abby, first staggered by the shock of the soundless thunder of the Mother Confessor's power, and now stunned by the abject anguish of the woman crumpled on the ground, felt a hand grip her arm. It was the wizard. With the back of his other hand he wiped blood from his mouth. He labored to get his breath. "Leave her to it. Zed. I'm so sorry, I tried to tell you not to use magic, but I didn't call loud enough for you to hear." He managed to smile through obvious pain. "I heard you. But why then did you use your gift? I thought that in the end, you would not be the kind of person to do such a terrible thing, and that you would show your true heart." He pulled her away from the cries. "We used you. We wanted them to think they had succeeded. You knew what I was going to do. You knew I was to bring you to them so that they could capture you. I had a good idea. From the first there seemed more to you than you presented. You are not very talented at being a spy and a traitor. Since we arrived here you've been watching the shadows and jumping at the chirp of every bug." The Mother Confessor rushed up. "Zed, are you all right?" He put a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be fine." His eyes still held the glaze of terror. "Thank you for not being late. For a moment, I feared." "I know." The Mother Confessor offered a quick smile. "Let us hope your trick was worth it. You have until dawn. She said they expect her to torture you all night before bringing you to them in the morning. Their scouts alerted Anargo to our troops' arrival. Back in the rushes the Mordsith was screaming as though she were being flayed alive. Shivers ran through Abby's shoulders. They'll hear her and know what's happened. Even if they could hear at this distance, they will think it is Zed, being tortured by her." The Mother Confessor took the knife from Abby's hand. "I am glad that you rewarded my faith and in the end chose not to join with them." Abby wiped her palms on her skirts, shamed by all she had done, by what she had intended to do. She was beginning to shake. "Are you going to kill her?" The Mother Confessor, despite looking bone-weary after having touched the Mordsith, still had iron resolve in her eyes. A Mordsith is different from anyone else. She does not recover from the touch of a confessor. She would suffer in profound agony until she dies sometime before morning. She glanced back towards the cries. "She has told us what we need to know, and Zed must have his power back. It is the merciful thing to do. It also buys me time to do what I must do." Zed's fingers turned Abby's face towards him, away from the shrieks. "And time to get Jana back. You will have until morning." "I will have until morning." What do you mean? I'll explain. But we must hurry if you are to have enough time. Now, take off your clothes. Abby was running out of time. She moved through the Thuron camp, holding herself stiff and tall, trying not to look frantic, even though that was how she felt. All night long she had been doing as the wizard had instructed, acting haughty. To anyone who noticed her, she directed disdain. To anyone who looked her way, thinking to speak to her, she growled. Not that many though, so much as dared to catch the attention of what appeared to be a red leather-clad Mordsith. Zed had told her to keep the Mordsith's weapon in her fist. It looked like nothing more than a small red leather rod. How it worked, Abby had no idea. The wizard had said only that it involved magic, and she wouldn't be able to call it to her aid, but it did have an effect on those who saw it in her hand. It made them melt back into the darkness, away from the light of the campfires, away from Abby. Those who were awake anyway. Although most people in the camp were sleeping, there was no shortage of alert guards. Zed had cut the long braid from the Mordsith who had attacked him, and tied it into Abby's hair. In the dark, the mismatch of color wasn't obvious. When the guards looked at Abby they saw a Mordsith, and quickly turned their attention elsewhere. By the apprehension on people's faces when they saw her coming, Abby knew she must look fearsome. They didn't know how her heart pounded. She was thankful for the mantle of night so that the Thurons couldn't see her knees trembling. She had seen only 2 real Mordsith, both sleeping, and she had kept far away from them, as Zed had warned her. Real Mordsith were not likely to be fooled so easily. Zed had given her until dawn. Time was running out. He had told her that if she wasn't back in time, she would die. Abby was thankful she knew the lay of the land, or long since she would have become lost among the confusion of tents, campfires, wagons, horses, and mules. Everywhere pikes and lances were stacked upright in circles with their points leaning together. Men, farriers, fletchers, blacksmiths and craftsmen of all sorts, worked through the night. The air was thick with wood smoke and rang with the sound of metal being shaped and sharpened and wood being worked for everything from bows to wagons. Abby didn't know how people could sleep through the noise, but sleep they did. Shortly the immense camp would wake to a new day, a day of battle, a day the soldiers went to work doing what they did best. They were getting a good night's sleep so they would be rested for the killing of the Midlands army. From what she had heard, Thuron soldiers were very good at their job. Abby had searched relentlessly, but she had been unable to find her father, her husband, or her daughter. She had no intention of giving up. She had resigned herself to the knowledge that if she didn't find them, she would die with them. She had found captives tied together and staked to trees, or the ground, to keep them from running. Many more were chained. Some she recognized, but many more she didn't. Most were kept in groups and under guard. Abby never once saw a guard asleep at his post. When they looked her way, she acted as if she were looking for someone, and she wasn't going to go easy on them when she found them. Zed had told her that her safety, and the safety of her family, depended on her playing the part convincingly. Abby thought about these people hurting her daughter, and it wasn't hard to act angry. But she was running out of time. She couldn't find them, and she knew that Zed would not wait. Too much was at stake, she understood that now. She was coming to appreciate that the wizard and the mother confessor were trying to stop a war, that they were people resolved to the dreadful task of weighing the lives of a few against the lives of many. Abby lifted another tent flap, and saw soldiers sleeping. She squatted and looked at the faces of prisoners tied to wagons. They stared back with hollow expressions. She bent to gaze at the faces of children pressed together in nightmares. She couldn't find Jana. The huge camp sprawled across the hilly countryside. There were 1,000 places she could be. As she marched along a crooked line of tents, she scratched at her wrist. Only when she went farther did she notice that it was the bracelet warming that made her wrist itch. It warmed yet more as she proceeded, but then the warmth began fading. Her brow twitched. Out of curiosity, she turned and went back the way she had come. Where a pathway between tents turned off, her bracelet tingled again with warmth. Abby paused a moment, looking off into the darkness. The sky was just beginning to color with light. She took the path between the tents, following until the bracelet cooled, then backtracked to where it warmed again and took a new direction where it warmed yet more. Abby's mother had given her the bracelet, telling her to wear it always, and that someday it would be of value. Abby wondered if somehow the bracelet had magic that would help her find her daughter. With dawn nearing, this seemed the only chance she had left. She hurried onward, wending where the warmth from the bracelet directed. The bracelet led her to an expanse of snoring soldiers. There were no prisoners in sight. Guards patrolled the men in bedrolls and blankets. There was one tent set among the big men, for an officer, she guessed. Not knowing what else to do, Abby strode among the sleeping men. Near the tent, the bracelet sent tingling heat up her arm. Abby saw that sentries hung around the small tent like flies around meat. The canvas sides glowed softly, probably from a candle inside. Off to the side, she noticed a sleeping form different from the men. As she got closer, she saw that it was a woman. Mariska, the old woman, breathed with a little raspy whistle as she slept. Abby stood paralyzed. Guards looked up at her. Needing to do something before they asked any questions, Abby scowled at them and marched towards the tent. She tried not to make any noise. The guards might think she was a Mordsith, but Mariska would not long be fooled. A glare from Abby turned the guards' eyes to the dark countryside. Her heart pounding nearly out of control, Abby gripped the tent flap. She knew Jana would be inside. She told herself that she must not cry out when she saw her daughter. She reminded herself that she must put a hand over Jana's mouth before she could cry out with joy, lest they be caught before they had a chance to escape. The bracelet was so hot it felt as if it would blister her skin. Abby ducked into the low tent. A trembling little girl huddled in a tattered wool cloak sat in blankets on the ground. She stared up with big eyes that blinked with the terror of what might come next. Abby felt a stab of anguish. It was not Jana. They stared at each other, this little girl and Abby. The child's face was lit clearly by the candle set to the side, as Abby's must be. In those big gray eyes that looked to have beheld unimaginable terrors, the little girl seemed to reach a judgment. Her arms stretched up in supplication. Instinctively, Abby fell to her knees and scooped up the little girl, hugging her small trembling body. The girl's spindly arms came out from the tattered cloak and wrapped around Abby's neck, holding on for dear life. "Help me. Please," the child whimpered in Abby's ear. Before she had picked her up, she had seen the face in the candlelight. There was no doubt in Abby's mind. It was Zed's daughter. "I've come to help you," Abby comforted. Zed sent me. The child moaned expectantly. Abby held the girl out at arm's length. I'll take you to your father, but you mustn't let these people know I'm rescuing you. Can you play along with me? Can you pretend that you're my prisoner, so that I can get you away? Near tears, the girl nodded. She had the same wavy hair as Zed, and the same eyes, although they were an arresting gray, not hazel. Good, Abby whispered, cupping a chilly cheek, almost lost in those gray eyes. Trust me, then, and I will get you away. I trust you, came the small voice. Abby snatched up a rope lying nearby and looped it around the girl's neck. I'll try not to hurt you, but I must make them think you are my prisoner. The girl cast a worried look at the rope, as if she knew the rope well, and then nodded that she would go along. Abby stood, once outside the tent, and by the rope pulled the child out after her. The guards looked her way. Abby started out. One of them scowled as he stepped close. What's going on? Abby stomped to a halt and lifted the red leather rod, pointing it at the guard's nose. She has been summoned. And who are you to question? Get out of my way or I'll have you gutted and cleaned for my breakfast. The man paled and hurriedly stepped aside. Before he had time to reconsider, Abby charged off, the girl in tow at the end of the rope, dragging her heels, making it look real. No one followed. Abby wanted to run, but she couldn't. She wanted to carry the girl, but she couldn't. It had to look as if a Mordsith was taking a prisoner away. Rather than take the shortest route back to Zed, Abby followed the hills upriver to a place where the trees offered concealment almost to the water's edge. Zed had told her where to cross, and warned her not to return by a different way. He had set traps of magic to prevent the Thurons from charging down from the hills to stop whatever it was he was going to do. Closer to the river she saw, downstream away, a bank of fog hanging close to the ground. Zed had emphatically warned her not to go near any fog. She suspected it a poison cloud of some sort that he had conjured. The sound of the water told her she was close to the river. The pink sky provided enough light to finally see it when she reached the edge of the trees. Although she could see the massive camp on the hills in the distance behind her, she saw no one following. Abby took the rope from the child's neck. The girl watched her with those big round eyes. Abby lifted her and held her tight. Hold on, and keep quiet. Pressing the girl's head to her shoulder, Abby ran for the river. There was light, but it was not the dawn. They had crossed the frigid water and made the other side when she first noticed it. Even as she ran along the bank of the river, before she could see the source of the light, Abby knew that magic was being called there that was unlike any magic she had ever seen before. A sound, low and thin, whined up the river towards her. A smell, as if the air itself had been burned, hung along the riverbank. The little girl clung to Abby, tears running down her face, afraid to speak, afraid, it seemed, to hope that she had at last been rescued, as if asking a question might somehow make it all vanish like a dream upon waking. Abby felt tears coursing down her own cheeks. When she rounded a bend in the river, she spotted the wizard. He stood in the center of the river, on a rock that Abby had never before seen. The rock was just large enough to clear the surface of the water by a few inches, making it almost appear as if the wizard stood on the surface of the water. Before him as he faced towards distant Thara, shapes, dark and wavering, floated in the air. They curled around, as if confiding in him, conversing, warning, tempting him with floating arms and reaching fingers that wreathed like smoke. Animate light twisted up around the wizard. Colors both dark and wondrous glimmered about him, cavorting with the shadowy forms undulating through the air. It was at once the most enchanting and the most frightening thing Abby had ever seen. No magic her mother conjured had ever seemed aware. But the most frightening thing by far was what hovered in the air before the wizard. It appeared to be a molten sphere, so hot it glowed from within, its surface a crackling of fluid dross. An arm of water from the river magically turned skyward in a fountain spray, and poured down over the rotating silvery mass. The water hissed and steamed as it hit the sphere, leaving behind clouds of white vapor to drift away in the gentle dawn wind. The molten form blackened at the touch of the water cascading over it, and yet the intense inner heat melted the glassy surface again as fast as the water cooled it, making the whole thing bubble and boil in midair, a pulsing sinister menace. Transfixed, Abby let the child slip to the silty ground. The little girl's arms stretched out. "Papa." He was too far away to hear her, but he heard. Zed turned, at once larger than life in the midst of magic, Abby could see but not begin to fathom, yet at the same time small with the frailty of human need. Tears filled his eyes as he gazed at his daughter standing beside Abby. This man who seemed to be consulting with spirits looked as if for the first time he were seeing a true apparition. Zed leaped off the rock and charged through the water. When he reached her and took her up in the safety of his arms, she began to wail at last with the contained terror released. There, dear one," Zed comforted. "Papa is here now." "Oh Papa," she cried against his neck, "they hurt Mama. They were wicked. They hurt her so." He hushed her tenderly. "I know, dear one. I know." For the first time, Abby saw the sorceress and the mother confessor standing off to the side watching. They too shed tears at what they were seeing. Though Abby was glad for the wizard and his daughter, the sight only intensified the pain in her chest at what she had lost. She was choked with tears. There, dear one," Zed was cooing. "You're safe, now. Papa won't let anything happen to you. You're safe now." Zed turned to Abby. By the time he had smiled his tearful appreciation, the child was asleep. "A little spell," he explained, and Abby's brow twitched with surprise. "She needs to rest. I need to finish what I am doing." He put his daughter in Abby's arms. "Abby, would you take her up to your house where she can sleep until I'm finished here? Please, put her in bed and cover her up to keep her warm. She will sleep for now." Thinking about her own daughter in the hands of the brutes across the river, Abby could only nod before turning to the task. She was happy for Zed, and even felt pride at having rescued his little girl, but as she ran for her home, she was near to dying with grief over her failure to recover her own family. Abby settled the dead weight of the sleeping child into her bed. She drew the curtain across the small window in her bedroom, and unable to resist, smoothed back silky hair and pressed a kiss to the soft brow before leaving the girl to her blessed rest. With the child safe at last and asleep, Abby raced back down the knoll to the river. She thought to ask Zed to give her just a little more time so she could return to look for her own daughter. Fear for Jana had her heart pounding wildly. He owed her a debt, and had not yet seen it through. Wringing her hands, Abby came to a panting halt at the water's edge. She watched the wizard up on his rock in the river, light and shadow coursing up around him. She had been around magic enough to have the sense to fear approaching him. She could hear his chanted words, though they were words she had never heard before. She recognized the idiosyncratic cadence of words spoken in a spell, words calling together frightful forces. On the ground beside her was the strange grace she had seen him draw before, the one that breached the worlds of life and death. The grace was drawn with a sparkling, pure white sand that stood out in stark relief against the dark silt. Abby shuddered even to look upon it, much less contemplate its meaning. Around the grace, carefully drawn with the same sparkling white sand, were geometric forms of magical invocations. Abby lowered her fists, about to call out to the wizard, when Delora leaned close. Abby flinched in surprise. "Not now, Abigail," the sorceress murmured. "Don't disturb him in the middle of this part." Reluctantly, Abby heeded the sorceress's words. The mother confessor was there too. Abby chewed her bottom lip as she watched the wizard throw up his arms. Sparkles of colored light curled up along twisting shafts of shadows. "But I must. I haven't been able to find my family. He must help me. He must save them. It's a debt of bones that must be satisfied." The other two women shared a look. "Abby," the mother confessor said, "he gave you a chance, gave you time. He tried. He did his best, but he has everyone else to think of, now." The mother confessor took up Abby's hand, and the sorceress put an arm around Abby's shoulders as she stood weeping on the riverbank. It wasn't supposed to end this way, not after all she had been through, not after all she had done. Despair crushed her. The wizard, his arms raised, called forth more light, more shadows, more magic. The river roiled around him. The hissing thing in the air grew as it slowly slumped closer to the water. Shafts of light shot from the hot, rotating, bloom of power. The sun was rising over the hills behind the Tharons. This part of the river wasn't as wide as elsewhere, and Abby could see the activity in the trees beyond. Men moved about, but the fog hanging on the far bank kept them wary, kept them in the trees. Also across the river, at the edge of the tree-covered hills, another wizard had appeared to conjure magic. He too stood atop a rock as his arms launched sparkling light up into the air. Abby thought that the strong morning sun might outshine the conjured illuminations, but it didn't. Abby could stand it no longer. "Zed," she called out across the river. "Zed. Please, you promised. I found your daughter. What about mine? Please don't do this until she is safe." Zed turned and looked at her as if from a great distance, as if from another world. Arms of dark forms caressed him. Fingers of dark smoke dragged along his jaw, urging his attention back to them, but he gazed instead at Abby. "I'm so sorry." Despite the distance, Abby could clearly hear his whispered words. "I gave you time to try to find them. I can spare no more, or countless other mothers will weep for their children, mothers still living, and mothers in the spirit world." Abby cried out in an anguished wail as he turned back to the ensorcelment. The two women tried to comfort her, but Abby was not to be comforted in her grief. Thunder rolled through the hills. A clacking clamor from the spell around Zed rose to echo up and down the valley. Shafts of intense light shot upward. It was a disorienting sight, light shining up into sunlight. Across the river, the counter to Zed's magic seemed to spring forth. Arms of light twisted like smoke, lowering to tangle with the light radiating up around Zed. The fog along the riverbank diffused suddenly. In answer, Zed spread his arms wide. The glowing, tumbling furnace of molten light thundered. The water sluicing over it roared as it boiled and steamed. The air wailed as if in protest. Behind the wizard across the river, the Dharan soldiers were pouring out of the trees, driving their prisoners before them. People cried out in terror. They quailed at the wizard's magic, only to be driven onward by the spears and swords at their backs. Abby saw several who refused to move fall to the blades. At the mortal cries, the rest rushed onward, like sheep before wolves. If whatever Zed was doing failed, the army of the Midlands would then charge into this valley to confront the enemy. The prisoners would be caught in the middle. A figure worked its way up along the opposite bank, dragging a child behind. Abby's flesh flashed icy cold with sudden frigid sweat. It was Mariska. Abby shot a quick glance back over her shoulder. It was impossible. She squinted across the river. No. Zed called out. It was Zed's little girl that Mariska had by the hair. Somehow, Mariska had followed and found the child sleeping in Abby's home. With no one there to watch over her as she slept, Mariska had stolen the child back. Mariska held the child out before herself, for Zed to see. Cease and surrender, Zorander, or she dies. Abby tore away from the arms holding her and charged into the water. She struggled to run against the current, to reach the wizard. Part way there, he turned to stare into her eyes. Abby froze. I'm sorry. Her own voice sounded to her like a plea before death. I thought she was safe. Zed nodded in resignation. It was out of his hands. He turned back to the enemy. His arms lifted to his sides. His fingers spread, as if commanding all to stop, magic and men alike. Let the prisoners go. Zed called across the water to the enemy wizard. Let them go, Anargo, and I'll give you all your lives. Anargo's laugh rang out over the water. Surrender, Mariska hissed, or she dies. The old woman pulled out the knife she kept in the wrap around her waist. She pressed the blade to the child's throat. The girl was screaming in terror, her arms reaching to her father, her little fingers clawing the air. Abby struggled ahead into the water. She called out, begging Mariska to let Zed's daughter go free. The woman paid no more heed to Abby than to Zed. Last chance. Mariska called. You heard her, Anargo growled out across the water. Surrender now or she will die. You know I can't put myself above my people. Zed called back. This is between us, Anargo. Let them all go. Anargo's laugh echoed up and down the river. You are a fool, Zorander. You had your chance. His expression twisted to rage. Kill her, he screamed to Mariska. Fists at his side, Zed shrieked. The sound seemed to split the morning with its fury. Mariska lifted the squealing child by her hair. Abby gasped in disbelief as the woman sliced the little girl's throat. The child flailed. Blood spurted across Mariska's gnarly fingers as she viciously sawed the blade back and forth. She gave a final, mighty yank of the knife. The blood-soaked body dropped in a limp heap. Abby felt vomit welling up in the back of her throat. The silted dirt of the riverbank turned a wet red. Mariska held the severed head high with a howl of victory. Strings of flesh and blood swung beneath it. The mouth hung in a slack, silent cry. Abby threw her arms around Zed's legs. "Dear spirits, I'm sorry. Oh Zed, forgive me." She wailed in anguish, unable to gather her senses at witnessing a sight so grisly. "And now, child," Zed asked in a hoarse voice from above, "what would you have me do? Would you have me let them win, to save your daughter from what they have done to mine? Tell me, child, what should I do?" Abby couldn't beg for the life of her family at a cost of such people rampaging unchecked across the land. Her sickened heart wouldn't allow it. How could she sacrifice the lives and peace of everyone else just so her loved ones would live? She would be no better than Mariska, killing innocent children. "Kill them all!" Abby screamed up at the wizard. She threw her arm out, pointing at Mariska and the hateful wizard Anargo. "Kill the bastards! Kill them all!" Zed's arms flung upward. The morning cracked with a peal of thunder. As if he had loosed it, the molten mass before him plunged into the water. The ground shook with a jolt. A huge geyser of water exploded forth. The air itself quaked. All around the most dreadful rumbling whipped the water into froth. Abby, squatted down with the water to her waist, felt numb not only from the cold, but also from the cold knowledge that she'd been forsaken by the good spirits she had always thought would watch over her. Zed turned and snatched her arm, dragging her up on the rock with him. It was another world. The shapes around them called to her too. They reached out, bridging the distance between life and death. Searing pain, frightful joy, profound peace, spread through her at their touch. Light moved up through her body, filling her like air filled her lungs, and exploded in showers of sparks in her mind's eye. The thick howl of the magic was deafening. Green light ripped through the water. Across the river, Anargo had been thrown to the ground. The rock atop which he had stood had shattered into needle-like shards. The soldiers called out in fright as the air all about danced with swirling smoke and sparks of light. "Run!" Mariska screamed. "While you have the chance. Run for your lives." Already she was racing towards the hills. "Leave the prisoners to die. Save yourselves. Run!" The mood across the river suddenly galvanized with a single determination. The Thurons dropped their weapons. They cast aside the ropes and chains holding the prisoners. They kicked up dirt as they turned and ran. In a single instant, the whole of an army that had a moment before stood grimly facing them, were all, as if of a single fright, running for their lives. From the corner of her eye, Abby saw the mother confessor and the sorceress struggling to run into the water. Although the water was hardly above their knees, it bogged them down in their rush nearly as much as would mud. Abby watched it all as if in a dream. She floated in the light surrounding her. Pain and rapture were one within her. Light and dark, sound and silence, joy and sorrow, all were one, everything and nothing together in a cauldron of raging magic. Across the river, the Thuron army had vanished into the woods. Dust rose above the trees, marking their horses, wagons, and footfalls racing away, while at the riverbank, the mother confessor and the sorceress were shoving people into the water, screaming at them, though Abby didn't hear the words, so absorbed was she by the strange harmonious trills twisting her thoughts into visions of dancing color overlaying what her eyes were trying to tell her. She thought briefly that surely she was dying. She thought briefly that it didn't matter. And then her mind was swimming again in the cold color and hot light, the drumming music of magic and worlds meshing. The wizard's embrace made her feel as if she were being held in her mother's arms again. Maybe she was. Abby was aware of the people reaching the midland side of the river and running ahead of the mother confessor and sorceress. They vanished into the rushes, and then Abby saw them far away, beyond the tall grass, running uphill, away from the sublime sorcery erupting from the river. The world thundered around her. A subterranean thump brought sharp pain deep in her chest. A whine, like steel being shredded, tore through the morning air. All around the water danced and quaked. Hot steam felt as if it would scald Abby's legs. The air went white with it. The noise hurt her ears so much that she squeezed her eyes shut. She saw the same thing with her eyes closed as she saw with them open, shadowy shapes swirling through the green air. Everything was going crazy in her mind, making no sense. Green fury tore at her body and soul. Abby felt pain, as if something inside her tore asunder. She gasped and opened her eyes. A horrific wall of green fire was receding away from them, towards the far side of the river. Founts of water lashed upward, like a thunderstorm in reverse. Lightning laced together above the surface of the river. As the conflagration reached the far bank, the ground beneath it rent apart. Shafts of violet light shot up from the ripping wounds in the earth, like the blood of another realm. Worse, though, than any of it, were the howls. Howls of the dead, Abby was sure. It felt as if her own soul moaned in sympathy with the agony of cries filling the air. From the receding green wall of glimmering fire, the shapes twisted and turned, calling, begging, trying to escape the world of the dead. She understood now that that was what the wall of green fire was, death, come to life. The wizard had breached the boundary between worlds. Abby had no idea how much time passed. In the grip of the strange light in which she swam there seemed to be no time, any more than there was anything solid. There was nothing familiar about any of the sensations upon which to hang understanding. It seemed to Abby that the wall of green fire had halted its advance in the trees on the far hillside. The trees over which it had passed, and those she could see embraced by the shimmering curtain, had blackened and shriveled at the profound touch of death itself. Even the grass over which the grim presence had passed looked to have been baked black and crisp by a high summer sun. As Abby watched the wall, it dulled. As she stared, it seemed to waver in and out of her vision, sometimes a glimmering green gloss, like molten glass, and sometimes no more than a pale hint, like a fog just now passed from the air. To each side, it was spreading, a wall of death raging across the world of life. Abby realized she heard the river again, the comfortable, common, sloshing, lapping, burbling sounds that she lived her life hearing but most of the time didn't notice. Zed hopped down from the rock. He took her hand and helped her down. Abby gripped his hand tightly to brace against the dizzying sensations swimming through her head. Zed snapped his fingers, and the rock upon which they had just stood leaped into the air, causing her to gasp in fright. In an instant so brief that she doubted she had seen it, Zed caught the rock. It had become a small stone, smaller than an egg. He winked at her as he slipped it into a pocket. She thought the wink the oddest thing she could imagine, odder even than the boulder, now a stone in his pocket. On the bank, the mother confessor and the sorceress waited. They took her arms, helping her out of the water. The sorceress looked grim. "Zed, why isn't it moving?" It sounded to Abby more like an accusation than a question. Either way, Zed ignored it. "Zed," Abby mumbled, "I'm so sorry. It's my fault. I shouldn't have left her alone. I should have stayed. I'm so sorry." The wizard, hardly hearing her words, was looking off to the wall of death on the other side of the river. He brought his clawed fingers up past his chest, calling something forth from within himself. With a sudden thump to the air, fire erupted between his hands. He held it out as he would hold an offering. Abby threw an arm up in front of her face at the heat. Zed lifted the roiling ball of liquid fire. It grew between his hands, tumbling and turning, roaring and hissing with rage. The three women backed away. Abby had heard of such fire. She had once heard her mother name it in a hushed tone, "wizard's fire." Even then, not seeing or knowing its like, those whispered words forming a picture in Abby's mind as her mother recounted it, had sent a chill through Abby. Wizard's fire was the bane of life, called forth to scourge an enemy. This could be nothing else. "For killing my love, my Erilyn, the mother of our daughter, and all the other innocent loved ones of innocent people," Zed whispered, "I send you Panis Ral, the gift of death." The wizard opened his arms outward. The liquid blue and yellow fire, bidden by its master, tumbled forward, gathering speed, roaring away towards Thara. As it crossed the river, it grew like angry lightning blooming forth, wailing with wrathful fury, reflecting in glimmering points from the water in thousands of bright sparkles. The wizard's fire shot across the growing wall of green, just catching the upper edge. At the contact, green flame flared forth, some of it tearing away, caught up behind the wizard's fire, trailing after like smoke behind flame. The deadly mix howled towards the horizon. Everyone stood transfixed, watching, until all trace of it had vanished in the distance. When Zed, pale and drawn, turned back to them, Abby clutched his robes. "Zed, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't." He put his fingers to her lips to silence her. "There is someone waiting for you." He tilted his head. She turned. Back by the rushes, Philip stood holding Jana's hand. Abby gasped with a jolt of giddy joy. Philip grinned his familiar grin. At his other side, her father smiled and nodded his approval to her. Arms reaching, Abby ran to them. Jana's face wrinkled. She backed against Philip. Abby fell to her knees before her. "It's Mama," Philip said to Jana. "She just has herself some new clothes." Abby realized Jana was frightened by the red leather outfit she was wearing. Abby grinned through her tears. "Mama!" Jana cried at seeing the smile. Abby threw her arms around her daughter. She laughed and hugged Jana so hard the child squeaked in protest. Abby felt Philip's hand on her shoulder in loving greeting. Abby stood and threw an arm around him, tears choking her voice. Her father put a comforting hand to her back while she squeezed Jana's hand. "Zed, Delora," and the mother confessor gathered them and herded them up the hill towards the people waiting at the top. Soldiers, mostly officers, some that Abby recognized, a few other people from Edindrall, and the wizard Thomas waited with the freed prisoners. Among the people liberated were those of Coney Crossing, people who held Abby, the daughter of a sorceress, in no favor. But they were her people, the people from her home, the people she had wanted saved. Zed rested a hand on Abby's shoulder. Abby was shocked to see that his wavy brown hair was now partly snow-white. She knew without a looking-glass that hers had undergone the same transformation in the place beyond the world of life, where, for a time, they had been. "This is Abigail, born of Helsa," the wizard called out to the people gathered. "She is the one who went to Edindrall to seek my help. Though she does not have magic, it is because of her that you people are all free. She cared enough to beg for your lives." Abby, with Philip's arm around her waist and Janna's hand in hers, looked from the wizard to the sorceress, and then to the mother confessor. The mother confessor smiled. Abby thought it a cold-hearted thing to do in view of the fact that Zed's daughter had been murdered before their eyes not long before. She whispered as much. The mother confessor's smile widened. "Don't you remember?" she asked as she leaned close. "Don't you remember what I told you we call him?" Abby, confused by everything that had happened, couldn't imagine what the mother confessor was talking about. When she admitted she didn't, the mother confessor and the sorceress shepherded her onward, past the grave where Abby had reburied her mother's skull upon her return, and into the house. With a hand, the mother confessor eased back the door to Abby's bedroom. There, on the bed where Abby had placed her, was Zed's daughter, still sleeping. Abby stared in disbelief. "The trickster," the mother confessor said. "I told you that was our name for him." "And not a very flattering one," Zed grumbled as he stepped up behind them. "But, how?" Abby pressed her fingers to her temples. "I don't understand." Zed gestured. Abby saw, for the first time, the body lying just beyond the door out the back. It was Mariska. "When you showed me the room when we first came here," Zed told her, "I laid a few traps for those intent on harm. That woman was killed by those traps because she came here intent on taking my daughter from where she slept." "You mean it was all an illusion?" Abby was dumbfounded. "Why would you do such a cruel thing? How could you?" "I am the object of vengeance," the wizard explained. "I didn't want my daughter to pay the price her mother has already paid. Since my spell killed the woman as she tried to harm my daughter, I was able to use a vision of her to accomplish the deception. The enemy knew the woman, and that she acted for Enargo. I used what they expected to see to convince them and to frighten them into running and leaving the prisoners. I cast the death spell so that everyone would think they saw my daughter being killed. This way, the enemy thinks my daughter dead, and will have no reason to hunt her or ever again try to harm her. I did it to protect her from the unforeseen." The sorceress scowled at him. "If it were any but you, Zedicus, and for any reason but the reason you had, I'd see you brought up on charges for casting such a web as a death spell." She broke into a grin. "Well done, First Wizard." Outside, the officers all wanted to know what was happening. "No battle today," Zed told them. "I've just ended the war." They cheered with genuine joy. Had Zed not been the first wizard, Abby suspected they would have hoisted him on their shoulders. It seemed that there was no one more glad for peace than those whose job it was to fight for it. Wizard Thomas, looking more humble than Abby had ever seen him, cleared his throat. "Zorander, I simply can't believe what my own eyes have seen." His face finally took on its familiar scowl. "But we have people already in near revolt over magic. When news of this spreads, it is only going to make it worse. The demands for relief from magic grow every day, and you have fed the fury. With this, we're liable to have revolt on our hands." "I still want to know why it isn't moving," Delora growled from behind. "I want to know why it's just sitting there, all green and still." Zed ignored her and directed his attention to the old wizard. "Thomas, I have a job for you." He motioned several officers and officials from a dindril forward, and passed a finger before all their faces, his own turning grim and determined. "I have a job for all of you. The people have reason to fear magic. Today we have seen magic deadly and dangerous. I can understand those fears. In appreciation of these fears, I shall grant their wish." "What?" Thomas scoffed. "You can't end magic, Zorander. Not even you can accomplish such a paradox." "Not end it," Zed said. "But give them a place without it. I want you to organize an official delegation large enough to travel all the Midlands with the offer. All those who would quit a world with magic are to move to the lands to the west. There they shall set up new lives free of any magic. I shall ensure that magic cannot intrude on their peace." Thomas threw up his hands. "How can you make such a promise?" Zed's arm lifted to point off behind him, to the wall of green fire growing towards the sky. "I shall call up a second wall of death, through which none can pass. On the other side it shall be a place free of magic. There, people will be free to live their lives without magic. I want you all to see that the word is passed through the land. People have until spring to emigrate to the lands west. Thomas, you will warrant that none with magic make the journey. We have books we can use to ensure that we purge a place of any with a trace of magic. We can assure that there will be no magic there. In the spring, when all who wish have gone to their new homeland, I will seal them off from magic. In one fell swoop, I will satisfy the large majority of the petitions that come to us. They will have lives without magic. May the good spirits watch over them, and may they not come to regret their wish granted." Thomas pointed heatedly at the thing Zed had brought into the world. "But what about that thing? What if people go wandering into it in the dark? They will be walking into death, not only in the dark," Zed said. "Once it has stabilized, it will be hard to see at all. We will have to set up guards to keep people away. We will have to set aside land near the boundary and have men guard the area to keep people out." "Men?" Abby asked. "You mean you will have to start a corps of boundary wardens?" "Yes," Zed said, his eyebrows lifting, "that's a good name for them. Boundary wardens." Silence settled over those leaning in to hear the wizard's words. The mood had changed and was now serious with the grim matter at hand. Abby couldn't imagine a place without magic, but she knew how vehemently some wished it. Thomas finally nodded. "Zed, this time I think you've got it right. Sometimes we must serve the people by not serving them." The others mumbled their agreement, though, like Abby, it seemed to them a bleak solution. Zed straightened. "Then it is decided." He turned and announced to the crowd the end of the war, and the division to come in which those who had petitioned for years would finally have their petition granted, for those who wished it, a land outside the Midlands, without magic, would be created. While everyone was chattering about such a mysterious and exotic thing as a land without magic, or cheering and celebrating the end of the war, Abby whispered to Janet to wait with her father a moment. She kissed her daughter and then took the opportunity to pull Zed aside. "Zed, may I speak with you? I have a question." Zed smiled and took her by the elbow, urging Abby into her small home. "I'd like to check on my daughter. Come along." Abby cast caution to the winds and took the mother confessor's hand in one of hers, Dolores in the other, and pulled them in with her. They had a right to hear this too. "Zed," Abby asked once they were away from the crowd in her yard, "may I please know the debt your father owed my mother?" Zed lifted an eyebrow. "My father owed your mother no debt." Abby frowned. "But it was a debt of bones, passed down from your father to you, and from my mother to me." "Oh, it was a debt all right, but not owed to your mother, but by your mother." "What?" Abby asked in stunned confusion. "What do you mean?" Zed smiled. "When your mother was giving birth to you, she was in trouble. You both were dying in the labor. My father used magic to save her. Helsa begged him to save you too. In order to keep you in the world of the living and out of the keeper's grasp, without thought to his own safety, he worked far beyond the endurance anyone would expect of a wizard. Your mother was a sorceress and understood the extent of what was involved in saving your life. In appreciation of what my father had done, she swore a debt to him. When she died, the debt passed to you." Abby, eyes wide, tried to reconcile the whole thing in her mind. Her mother had never told her the nature of the debt. But you mean that it is I who owe the debt to you? You mean that the debt of bones is my burden?" Zed pushed open the door to the room where his daughter slept, smiling as he looked in. "The debt is paid, Abby. The bracelet your mother gave you had magic, linking you to the debt. Thank you for my daughter's life." Abby glanced to the mother confessor. "Trickster indeed. But why would you help me, if it was really not a debt of bones you owed me? If it was really a debt I owed you?" Zed shrugged. "We reap a reward merely in the act of helping others. We never know how, or if that reward will come back to us. Helping is the reward, none other is needed nor better." Abby watched the beautiful little girl sleeping in the room beyond. "I am thankful to the good spirits that I could help keep such a life in this world. I may not have the gift, but I can foresee that she will go on to be a person of import, not only for you, but for others." Zed smiled idly as he watched his daughter sleeping. "I think you may have the gift of prophecy, my dear, for she is already a person who has played a part in bringing a war to an end, and in so doing, saved the lives of countless people." The sorceress pointed out the window. "I still want to know why that thing isn't moving. It was supposed to pass over Thara and purge it of all life, to kill them all for what they have done." Her scowl deepened. "Why is it just sitting there?" Zed folded his hands. "It ended the war. That is enough. The wall is a part of the underworld itself, the world of the dead. Their army will not be able to cross it and make war on us for as long as such a boundary stands." "And how long will that be?" Zed shrugged. "Nothing remains forever. For now, there will be peace. The killing is ended. The sorceress did not look to be satisfied. But they were trying to kill us all. Well, now they can't. Delora, there are those in Dara who are innocent too. Just because Panis Ral wished to conquer and subjugate us, that does not mean that all the Dharan people are evil. Many good people in Dara have suffered under harsh rule. How could I kill everyone there, including all the people who have caused no harm, and themselves wish only to live their lives in peace? Delora wiped a hand across her face. Zedekias, sometimes I don't know about you. Sometimes you make a lousy wind of death. The mother confessor stood staring out the window, towards Dara. Her violet eyes turned back to the wizard. There will be those over there who will be your foes for life because of this, Zed. You have made bitter enemies with this. You have left them alive. Enemies, the wizard said, are the price of honor.